The icy winds of Eastern Europe cut through the small villages, carrying whispers of an impending storm. Hitler's ambitions were more than territorial, they were ideological. To him, the Soviet Union was not just a rival nation, it was the embodiment of everything he feared and despised: communism, Slavic peoples, and the threat to his vision of a pure empire. In Berlin, maps sprawled across war room tables, generals argued in tense voices, and Hitler's dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of obsession and paranoia. Every line on the map, every troop movement, was part of a plan fueled by fear and hatred. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin received reports of German mobilization with his usual composed demeanor. Years of purges had left him suspicious of everyone around him, even his closest aides. Yet, beneath the cold exterior, Stalin's mind calculated meticulously. He knew the German war machine was powerful, but he also understood its limits: the vastness of the Soviet land, the harsh winter, and the indomitable spirit of his people. Two leaders, each consumed by their own fears and hatreds, were about to clash in a war unlike any the world had seen. Hitler underestimated the resilience of the Soviet people. His ideology blinded him to the human spirit that could rise under oppression. Stalin, in contrast, used fear as a weapon, molding his nation into a relentless force. Propaganda in both nations portrayed the enemy as a monstrous figure, the ultimate villain. Behind this narrative, ordinary soldiers faced the grim reality of a war defined not only by tanks, planes, and artillery, but by psychological torment, betrayal, and the brutality of man against man. Fear became both a weapon and a curse. Hitler's growing paranoia about spies and traitors within his own ranks led to constant suspicion, while Stalin's purges ensured that his generals dreaded even the smallest misstep. The stage was set for a collision of two titans, each guided by hatred and fear, each commanding forces that would shape the fate of millions. Soon, the Eastern Front, stretching thousands of miles, would erupt into a theater of unimaginable suffering, courage, and strategy. Cities would burn, forests would echo with gunfire, and every step forward would test the limits of human endurance. Hitler's dream of swift victory would clash with Stalin's unyielding resolve, setting the stage for a confrontation that would decide not just the fate of nations, but the very nature of warfare itself. The seeds of hatred were sown, and history was about to bear witness to their devastating consequences. June 22, 1941, dawned with the sky tinged in cold gray as Operation Barbarossa began. Millions of German soldiers surged into the Soviet Union, their mechanized columns rumbling across the endless plains. Hitler's confidence was unshakable. He believed that the Soviet Union would crumble within weeks. The German army, trained, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient, advanced with precision, leaving scorched earth in its wake. Yet, the Russians did not falter. Stalin had already ordered scorched earth tactics and mobilized millions of soldiers, turning the vast land into a deadly trap for the invaders. Hitler's hatred for communism fueled a brutality that shocked even his own generals. Villages were destroyed, civilians massacred, and fear became a weapon of psychological warfare. But Stalin, cold and calculating, knew that patience was his greatest ally. The Soviet command began executing ambushes, utilizing guerrilla tactics, and drawing the Germans deeper into the unforgiving terrain. Winter was a looming weapon, and the German high command had underestimated the harshness of the Russian climate. The clash was not just of armies, but of ideologies and wills. Hitler's obsessive pursuit of annihilation drove him to make reckless decisions, splitting his forces across multiple fronts. Stalin, on the other hand, manipulated fear within his own ranks, ensuring unwavering loyalty and ruthless efficiency. Behind the front lines, millions of ordinary people endured hunger, displacement, and terror, their suffering a backdrop to the titanic struggle unfolding across forests, rivers, and cities. As tanks rolled across the smoldering fields and artillery fire lit the skies, both leaders watched through the fog of war. Hitler underestimated the strategic genius of his foe. Stalin, once underestimated, began orchestrating counterattacks that would eventually halt the German advance. Each side relied not only on firepower, but on the psychology of fear and control. The Eastern Front had become a crucible where courage and hatred, strategy and paranoia, intertwined. The early victories of the German Wehrmacht created a dangerous illusion of inevitability. Hitler's ego swelled with each captured town and each retreating Soviet unit. Yet beneath the surface, the tide was slowly shifting. Soviet resilience, rooted in loyalty to the motherland and disciplined by fear, began to strain the invaders. The seeds sown by Hitler's hatred were meeting the impenetrable force of Stalin's resolve. The outcome of this titanic clash would hinge not just on weapons and manpower, but on the indomitable spirit of millions caught in the storm. As autumn faded into the brutal winter of 1941, the German army found itself trapped in a nightmare it had never prepared for. The snow fell endlessly, burying tanks, choking engines, and freezing soldiers alive in the fields of Russia. The same land that Hitler had promised would fall easily now turned against him. The biting cold was merciless, metal froze to skin, rifles jammed, and supply lines collapsed under the crushing weight of blizzards. The German soldiers, clothed in thin uniforms, began to understand the true face of the Eastern Front. Hitler had ignored every warning from his generals. His arrogance convinced him that the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. But Stalin had been waiting for this moment. The Red Army, adapted to the winter and hardened by desperation, launched counterattacks that stunned the invaders. Soviet tanks, painted white for camouflage, emerged from the blinding snow like ghosts of vengeance. The morale of the German army began to crack. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. In Moscow, Stalin stood resolute. He refused to abandon the city even when German artillery thundered at its gates. His voice, broadcast over the radio, declared that every inch of Soviet soil must be defended to the last drop of blood. Across the frozen front lines, Soviet soldiers took those words as gospel. They fought in trenches carved from ice, their breath visible in the air, their determination stronger than steel. The Germans, unprepared for both the weather and the willpower of their enemies, began to falter. Fear turned inward among the Nazis. Starvation and frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Soldiers huddled together in abandoned villages, burning furniture for warmth. The once mighty German war machine became a ghost army crawling through the snow. Hitler, in his heated bunker, refused to see the truth. His hatred blinded him to reason. He ordered his soldiers to hold their positions, no retreat, no surrender, condemning thousands to death in the frozen wastes. For Stalin, the winter was more than a natural ally, it was a symbol of endurance. Soviet propaganda called it General Winter, the defender of Russia. Each passing day strengthened the Soviet resolve while crushing the Germans under despair. The fear that had driven both leaders had now turned against Hitler himself. His soldiers, once conquerors, were now victims of his pride. And as the temperature plummeted below -40 degrees, the dream of a swift victory turned to ash. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's obsession had a new name: Stalingrad. To him, it was more than a city. It was a symbol. Conquering the city that bore Stalin's name would strike a psychological blow to the Soviet Union and cement his dominance in the East. Yet this obsession would soon become the graveyard of his empire. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward Stalingrad with confidence. They were well armed, well trained, and experienced from victories across Europe. The Luftwaffe bombarded the city from the skies, reducing entire districts to smoking ruins. Firestorms swept through factories and homes, turning the Volga River red with blood. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, refused to flee. Stalin had ordered that, not a step back, a command that echoed across every street, every trench, every ruined building. As the Germans pushed deeper into the shattered city, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of urban warfare. Every building became a fortress, every alleyway a killing zone. Soviet snipers hid among the rubble, striking with deadly precision. The sound of artillery never ceased. The Volga froze with the onset of winter once more, but still the fighting continued. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because they fought for every inch, every floor, every basement. Like desperate animals, Hitler, blinded by pride, demanded total victory. He ignored the warnings that his army was overstretched and surrounded by danger. Stalin, on the other hand, watched calmly from Moscow. He understood that patience and endurance would crush his enemy. As the months passed, Soviet reinforcements secretly crossed the Volga at night, slipping through ice and darkness. The noose was tightening. Then, in November 1942, the Red Army struck back. Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement maneuver, slammed into the German flanks held by weaker Axis allies. Within days, the mighty Sixth Army was trapped inside Stalingrad. Paulus's men faced starvation, disease, and despair as the Soviet ring closed around them. Hitler refused to let them retreat. His fear of failure and hatred for surrender sealed their fate. Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was a living hell. The Germans, once conquerors, were now prisoners of their own arrogance. Stalin's city, reduced to rubble, had become the symbol of resistance. The tide of war had turned. The hunter had become the hunted, and Hitler's empire had begun its long, irreversible fall. The winter of 1943 descended like a judgment upon the German Sixth Army. Stalingrad, once envisioned as Hitler's great triumph, had become his greatest humiliation. Inside the frozen ruins, 300,000 German soldiers were trapped, starving, freezing, and surrounded by the relentless Red Army. Hitler's command was clear: not one step back, no surrender. But the reality was inescapable. Death surrounded them from every direction. General Friedrich Paulus, once confident and loyal, now faced the impossible. His men burned furniture for warmth, ate horses, even boiled leather belts to survive. Ammunition was running low, and food was gone. Frostbite blackened fingers. Disease spread through the ranks, and despair became their constant companion. The Luftwaffe's promise to supply the army from the air had failed miserably. Most planes were shot down, their cargo lost to the snow. Every message from Berlin brought only one order: hold the city. In Moscow, Stalin's confidence grew. Soviet propaganda celebrated every victory as a symbol of national rebirth. The defenders of Stalingrad were hailed as heroes, not just soldiers, but saviors of the motherland. The Soviet counteroffensive tightened its grip, and the ring around the German army closed completely. Day and night, artillery thundered. The ruins of the city glowed with fire under the endless snow, as though hell itself had risen to the surface. Inside his bunker, Hitler refused to face the truth. His hatred for Stalin had blinded him to logic. He blamed his generals, his soldiers, even fate, but never himself. He declared Paulus would fight to the last bullet, even promoting him to field marshal, hoping he would die with honor. But Paulus, broken by exhaustion and guilt, chose surrender over suicide. On February 2, 1943, the last German radio transmission from Stalingrad went silent. The once proud Sixth Army had been annihilated. The defeat shocked the world. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility shattered completely. Hitler's aura of unstoppable power was gone. His fear of losing control grew deeper, and his hatred for Stalin turned into desperation. The war that was supposed to end in swift victory had now become a nightmare that Germany could never escape. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and the power of human will against tyranny. For Stalin, it was the moment the tide of war changed forever. For Hitler, it was the beginning of the end, a wound from which his empire would never recover. After Stalingrad, something inside Adolf Hitler broke. The man who once stood before cheering crowds in Berlin now sat isolated in his bunker, haunted by defeat and consumed by paranoia. His empire still stretched across much of Europe, but the illusion of control was fading fast. The Führer no longer trusted anyone, not his generals, not his ministers, not even his closest friends. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every whisper a betrayal. The fear that had once driven his enemies now turned inward, poisoning his own command. Generals who spoke the truth were dismissed or executed. Hitler surrounded himself with yes-men, those who echoed his delusions rather than challenged them. He convinced himself that Germany's failures were the fault of cowards, traitors, and saboteurs. His hatred for Stalin grew into obsession. He began to believe that destiny itself was conspiring against him. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army gathered strength. Soviet industry, relocated deep into the Ural Mountains, was producing tanks, planes, and ammunition at an unstoppable pace. Stalin's leadership, cold, methodical, and merciless, was beginning to pay off. Yet Stalin himself ruled through fear. His secret police hunted anyone suspected of defeatism. Even as victory approached, paranoia ran through the Soviet ranks like electricity. Two dictators, each consumed by distrust, mirrored each other more than either would admit. In Hitler's inner circle, loyalty was a dangerous game. Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring all competed for the Führer's favor, whispering lies and conspiracies to keep their power. The war effort suffered. Strategic decisions were no longer based on logic, but on Hitler's mood swings. Entire divisions were sacrificed to satisfy his pride. The once mighty Wehrmacht was bleeding out on every front, trapped between Soviet steel and Hitler's delusions. As the Allies bombed German cities night after night, Hitler retreated deeper underground. His speeches, once filled with fiery conviction, became rants of desperation. He dreamed of miracle weapons that would save him, of last-minute victories that would never come. Even the most loyal officers began to realize the truth. Their leader had lost touch with reality. Fear, once his greatest tool, had turned against him. In Moscow, Stalin observed it all with satisfaction. He knew that Hitler's paranoia was his greatest weakness. While Hitler destroyed himself from within, Stalin's iron grip on his nation only tightened. The two men who had once divided Europe between them were now on opposite sides of fate, one collapsing into madness, the other rising from the ashes of ruin. The monster had turned inward. The empire built on fear was now devouring itself. And in the frozen silence of the Eastern Front, the echoes of Hitler's downfall had already begun. The Soviet war machine had transformed into an unstoppable force. From the ruins of Stalingrad and the ashes of millions, Stalin's army surged westward like a tidal wave of vengeance. The Red Army, hardened by years of suffering, now outnumbered and outgunned the Germans. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Bagration, struck the heart of the German lines with ferocity that stunned even Hitler's generals. Town after town fell, divisions were annihilated, and entire German armies were swallowed by the endless advance. The frozen plains that once slowed the Soviets now carried their thunderous assault toward Berlin. Soviet tanks rolled across rivers, their red stars gleaming against the gray sky. The cries of victory echoed where once only despair had reigned. In Berlin, Hitler raged. He accused his commanders of cowardice and betrayal, refusing to believe the scale of the disaster. His paranoia had grown into madness. Maps covered his walls, but reality no longer matched the lines he drew. He ordered impossible counterattacks, sending thousands of young boys, the Hitler Youth, to die in futile resistance. Germany's strength was bleeding out, its once mighty cities reduced to rubble under relentless Allied bombing. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin's voice was calm but cold. He demanded total revenge. Every village burned by the Germans, every life lost, would be avenged tenfold. Soviet propaganda filled the air with triumph and rage. Red banners waved over liberated towns, and soldiers scrawled messages on walls. For Stalingrad, for Mother Russia, the hatred that had fueled Hitler's war now burned against him, consuming everything in its path. The German retreat was chaotic. Exhausted soldiers trudged through mud and snow, haunted by the ghosts of their fallen comrades. The once disciplined Wehrmacht had become a desperate army in flight. The Soviets showed no mercy, Their memories of Nazi cruelty had erased compassion. Villages once occupied by Germans became sites of vengeance. Civilians cheered the Red Army, though their cheers often mixed with tears. As the Red Storm rolled westward, the fate of Hitler's empire was sealed. The illusion of the thousand-year Reich crumbled in less than 12. Stalin's armies had not only survived, they had triumphed. The dictator in Moscow watched with satisfaction as his greatest rival burned his empire from within. Fear and hatred had come full circle. In the distance, the thunder of artillery echoed like the heartbeat of revenge. The Soviet flag rose higher with each victory. Europe trembled as the red tide surged toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The war that began with arrogance was now ending in ashes, and the shadow of the hammer and sickle grew longer by the day. By early 1945, the walls of the Reich were collapsing. From the east, Stalin's Red Army thundered forward, their artillery lighting up the night skies of Poland and East Prussia. From the west, American, British, and French forces pushed across the Rhine, liberating cities one after another. The once invincible German war machine was cornered. Yet in his underground bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler refused to accept reality. Driven by paranoia and desperation, he clung to the fantasy of a miracle that would turn the tide, a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon that would destroy his enemies. His faith in imaginary victories grew even as his empire disintegrated. The Battle of the Bulge, his last great offensive in the West, had failed disastrously. Thousands of soldiers lay dead in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, sacrificed to his delusion. The Allies were now unstoppable, and the Reich was bleeding from every direction. In Moscow, Stalin watched with cold satisfaction. Reports from the front filled his desk. Soviet tanks had crossed into Germany itself. For Stalin, this was not merely victory, it was vengeance. His hatred for Hitler had turned into a relentless drive to crush Berlin and raise the Soviet flag over its ruins. Yet even as triumph neared, Stalin's distrust of his Western allies deepened. He feared that Churchill and Roosevelt would steal his victory, or halt his advance before Berlin fell. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was now laced with suspicion. The seeds of the Cold War already beginning to grow. Inside Germany, chaos ruled. Cities burned under constant bombing. Civilians fled eastward, terrified of the approaching Red Army, whose vengeance they knew would be merciless. The once proud citizens of the Reich now lived in fear, hiding in basements, clutching what little remained of their lives. Hitler's voice, once thunderous and commanding, had become a trembling echo in the radio waves. His speeches spoke of final victory even as reality collapsed around him. In the ruins of his bunker, Hitler's circle had shrunk to a handful of loyalists: Goebbels, Himmler, and Bormann. The walls vibrated with the sound of distant artillery. Berlin was surrounded. Every day, Hitler received reports of lost cities and captured generals. Yet his mind retreated deeper into delusion. He ordered imaginary divisions to defend phantom lines that no longer existed. Fear had consumed him completely. Fear of defeat, of betrayal, and of the inevitable end. Outside, the Red Army prepared for the final assault. The Soviet soldiers who had marched from the ashes of Stalingrad now stood at the gates of Berlin. The end of the Reich was near, and Hitler's final gamble had failed. What began with arrogance and hatred would now end in fire and ruin. April 1945, Berlin, once the heart of Hitler's mighty empire, had become a graveyard of shattered dreams. Soviet artillery thundered day and night, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Fires painted the night sky red as the Red Army closed its iron grip on the capital. Streets once filled with parades and triumphs now echoed with screams and explosions. The citizens of Berlin, trapped between fear and hopelessness, dug trenches and built barricades out of debris. Old men, women, and even children were handed rifles and told to defend the Reich. The so-called Volkssturm, the People's Army, stood trembling against the Soviet tanks. Most had never fired a gun before, yet propaganda still screamed through loudspeakers, "Fight to the last man." Hitler demanded it. Defeat was treason. Inside the Führerbunker, deep beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler sat pale and shaking. His once fierce eyes were now hollow, consumed by madness. Maps on his wall no longer showed reality, only fantasy. He spoke of phantom divisions that could save Berlin, of generals who were already dead, of betrayals that existed only in his mind. Even his most loyal officers could see the truth. The war was over, but no one dared say it aloud. Above ground, the Soviet soldiers advanced block by block. Every street was a battlefield. Grenades and Molotov cocktails turned buildings into infernos. German snipers fired from the shadows, only to be silenced by tanks that crushed walls and men alike. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. Stalin had ordered that Berlin must fall no matter the cost. The Red Army's banner had to fly over the Reichstag as a symbol of revenge for the millions who had died. In the midst of the chaos, the civilians suffered most. Mothers searched for food in burning buildings. Children cried in bomb shelters, and soldiers without hope still fought, because surrender meant death. Berlin, the city Hitler promised would rule the world, had become his tomb. By the night of April 29th, Soviet troops were less than a mile from the bunker. Hitler could hear the explosions above him. Reports came that Mussolini had been executed by his own people. His body hung upside down for all to see. The message was clear. The age of dictators was ending. That night, Hitler made his final decision. He married Eva Braun in a brief, quiet ceremony in the bunker. The next day, as the walls shook with Soviet artillery, he and Eva took their own lives. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. Outside, Soviet soldiers stormed the Reichstag, raising the red flag amid smoke and fire. The war in Europe was almost over. The man who once ruled through fear and hatred was gone, consumed by the very darkness he unleashed. May 1945, Berlin had fallen. Smoke still rose from the ruins as Soviet troops marched through the silent, shattered streets. Hitler was dead, his empire reduced to ashes. The Reich, which he had promised would last 1,000 years, had burned out in just 12. Germany was in ruins, its cities destroyed, its people broken, and its leader gone. The world stood in stunned silence. The nightmare was over. In the bunker, where the war's architect had met his end, silence replaced the madness. Above ground, Soviet soldiers discovered the remains of a fallen regime. Maps, orders, and the scattered papers of a man who believed he could control the world. Stalin had triumphed, but his victory was cold. He had destroyed Hitler, yet in doing so, he had created a new fear. The Soviet flag over Berlin marked not just the end of one tyranny, but the rise of another kind. In the West, celebrations erupted. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York. Soldiers embraced civilians. Strangers wept and sang together. After 6 years of unimaginable suffering, the guns finally fell silent. But behind the joy, the scars ran deep. Over 70 million lives had been lost. Cities lay in ruins, families torn apart, and entire nations forever changed. At the Nuremberg trials, the world confronted the true horror of Nazi rule. The crimes committed in Hitler's name were beyond imagination: the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the endless executions. The trials were not just about punishment, they were about memory. Humanity needed to remember, to ensure such evil would never return. As one prosecutor said, the world must know what happened here, so that it never happens again. In Moscow, Stalin began reshaping Eastern Europe under his control. Communist governments rose in Poland, Hungary, and beyond. The Iron Curtain was descending across Europe. The Allies, once united against Hitler, now faced a new enemy: each other. Suspicion and fear began to divide the victors, and within years, a new conflict emerged: the Cold War. For Germany, the price of hatred was total collapse. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin lay in ruins. The German people, once consumed by propaganda and pride, were now left to face the truth of what had been done in their name. Many wandered through the rubble, searching for food, family, and forgiveness. The war had ended, but peace was fragile. The world had changed forever. From the ashes of destruction rose new institutions: the United Nations, the Marshall Plan. NATO built on the hope that humanity could learn from its mistakes. In the end, it was not strength or conquest that shaped the future, but remembrance. Hitler's empire had been built on fear and hatred, and it was those very forces that destroyed him. The world would rebuild, scarred, but wiser, carrying the lesson that tyranny, no matter how powerful, always falls. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but the peace that followed was uneasy. The ruins of Berlin still smoldered as a new world began to take shape, one divided not by battlefields, but by ideology. The victors, who had fought shoulder to shoulder against Hitler, now turned suspicious eyes toward one another. The enemy had changed, but the fear remained. In the East, Stalin's Soviet Union emerged from the war bloodied yet unbroken. 27 million of his people were dead, yet his armies now occupied half of Europe. From Warsaw to Budapest, red flags replaced Nazi banners. The Kremlin's grip tightened over Eastern Europe, its tanks enforcing a new kind of order, not of liberation, but control. For Stalin, victory meant power. His dream was to spread communism across the world, ensuring that never again would Russia face invasion from the West. In the West, the United States stood at the height of its power. Its cities were untouched by war, its industries booming, its atomic bomb unmatched. To President Truman, Stalin's expansion looked less like security and more like conquest. Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, a barrier of ideology dividing East from West, freedom from tyranny. The allies of yesterday were becoming the rivals of tomorrow. Germany itself became the symbol of this division. The country was carved into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was split in two. Families, once united, now found themselves on opposite sides of a new invisible wall. It was not yet made of concrete, but of mistrust. The world was holding its breath. In 1947, the tension hardened. The US announced the Marshall Plan, pouring billions into rebuilding Western Europe. Stalin saw it as a weapon: economic domination disguised as aid. In response, he created the Common Form, tightening Soviet control over his allies. Words replaced bullets, but the war of ideas had begun. Each side built alliances, stockpiled weapons, and prepared for a conflict that everyone feared, but no one wanted. The shadow of Hitler's war still haunted the world. Cities rebuilt themselves over bones and ashes, but the fear of annihilation remained. This time, it was not tanks that threatened humanity. It was the atom. The same weapon that ended the war in Japan now hung over the world like a sword. One mistake, one misunderstanding, could destroy everything. The Second World War had ended with victory, but not peace. The world Hitler tried to conquer was now trapped in a new struggle, one between democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and communism, hope and fear. The hatred that had once driven Europe to destruction had changed its shape, but not its danger. The world had entered a new kind of war, one that would be fought not in trenches, but in shadows. By the early 1950s, the uneasy peace that followed World War II had curdled into fear. The alliance that once destroyed Hitler was now split into the United States and its allies on one side, the Soviet Union and its satellites on the other. The world was no longer united by victory, but divided by ideology, and both sides were building weapons powerful enough to destroy the planet. The nuclear age had begun. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima was no longer just a memory, it was a warning. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, shocking the West. America's monopoly on nuclear power had ended. In response, the United States created the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times stronger than the one dropped on Japan. Stalin soon ordered his scientists to match it. The arms race had begun, and fear became the new battlefield. Ordinary people lived under the shadow of annihilation. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools, as if wooden desks could shield them from atomic fire. Governments built underground shelters, sirens wailed during tests, and newspapers printed maps of potential blast zones. Every new test in the desert, in the Arctic, or under the ocean, reminded humanity how close it stood to extinction. But this war was not only fought with bombs. It was fought in silence in the corridors of power and in the shadows of cities. Spies became soldiers in this invisible war. The CIA and KGB waged battles of deception and secrets, recruiting double agents, planting false information, and stealing blueprints of missiles and technology. Trust vanished from diplomacy. Every handshake between East and West hid a question: who will strike first? Berlin remained the heart of the tension, a divided city in a divided world. Families separated by barbed wire stared across, checkpoints at loved ones they might never see again. At night, the city whispered with fear as agents crossed borders under false names. To the east, Stalin's successors built loyalty through force. To the west, America and its allies built prosperity through aid. Both claimed to protect freedom. Both prepared for war. As decades passed, the competition reached the skies. The Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first satellite to orbit Earth. For the first time, humanity looked to the heavens and saw conflict there too. The race for space had begun, not for discovery, but for dominance. The Cold War was no longer cold. It burned silently through science, politics, and paranoia. The same fear and hatred that once fueled Hitler's madness now drove two superpowers to the brink of self-destruction. The world had survived one world war, but now lived beneath the shadow of one it could never survive.